Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim, and it's now time to begin our regular halacha class. This evening, we're going to focus on the halacha. This is just on the borderline of halacha, the halacha of blowing the shofar at the very end of Yom Kippur. Let's take a look at the sources and see what they have to teach us. To go. Here it is. Now, I say that what we're going to talk about this evening is the halacha of the last blowing of the shofar on Yom Kippur. And I say this is a borderline case because really what we're talking about is a minhag. As we're about to see, there is no source in the Mishnah, there is no source in the Gemara or in the halachic midrashim, the sifra, the sifrei. There is no good source in the words of Chazal to support this minhag. And whenever I encounter such a minhag, and there are tons of them, they all make me a little bit nervous. The reason I become a little bit nervous when I encounter minhagim such as we're about to investigate, which have no source in Chazal, no source in the Mishnah, Gemara, and closely related literature. I'm left with a lingering feeling that maybe there's something wrong with the minhag. After all, the Torah does teach us Bal Tosif v'Bal Tigra. The Torah does teach us that there are 613 commandments, and we dare not add any new commandments, and we dare not subtract any commandments from the list of 613. The list of mitzvahs is immutable. Of course, as with everything else in the world of Torah, rabbis disagree about exactly what's on that list of 613, but that there are 613 which cannot be added to or subtracted from, everyone agrees to that. Just what's on the list and what isn't on the list, well, rabbis have been arguing about that since the beginning of time. The uh, well, my nervousness is fueled by the suspicion that a minhag to do something is somehow a violation of adding something new to the Torah, and that we're not allowed to do. Well, let's see what the sources have to say. Let's allow the sources to speak for themselves. I begin with the Zohar. I surely don't want to dwell on the Kabbalistic issues underlying blowing the shofar at the very end of Yom Kippur. But the Zohar, how old is the Zohar? Normally I try to point out the date, an approximate date of the sources that we're dealing with, so you can have a sense of chronology. Well, the origin of the Zohar is itself very controversial. Good grief, everything is controversy on top of controversy. The According to the to most Mikubalim, according to most rabbis in the mystical tradition, the Zohar HaKodesh that we're about to quote from, the surely the most important source of Jewish mysticism, according to most rabbis in the mystical tradition, according to most Mikubalim, the source is ancient, going all the way back to the days of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the great names in early rabbinic history. On the other hand, according to some Mikubalim, according to some mystics and historians in universities today, the source of the Zohar, historical source of the Zohar, is in the High Middle Ages, or slightly after the High Middle Ages, around the 13th century. I didn't put a date on this because let's devote uh, let's devote some classes to the historical investigation regarding the antiquity of the Zohar in some other forum, not here. But this is what it says in the Zohar, and I copied this from an online text of the Sulam, which is apparently not copyrighted. Takinu litkoa shofar b'yom kippurim l'salka kol de'ihuvav. We blow the shofar. They instituted the blowing of the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur in order to emphasize one of the letters of the holy name of God. Right? The holy name of God consists of four letters, one of which is Vav. L'herut, the letter Vav in God's name represents Herut, freedom, which is rooted in Bina, rooted in understanding. Itmarba, and we learn in the verse, says in the verse in the Torah, Bechol tzaratam, whenever you have suffering, when this is what it says in the verse in the Torah, Yeshayahu the prophet said, Bechol tzaratam, whenever you have suffering, and when do you have suffering? On Yom Kippur, when you're not allowed to eat, you're not allowed to drink, you're not allowed to wash, you're not allowed to wear leather shoes. Yom Kippur is the time of suffering. B'chol tzaratam, on Yom Kippur, lo tzar. Now, this lo tzar is written twice. That is in the scroll. If you're going to write, if the scribe is going to write out Sefer Yeshayahu by hand in a scroll, like they have in my synagogue just across the street, you write it with an aleph, lo, meaning not. But of course, when it's read out loud as part of the Haftarah, for example, it's read lo with a vav, meaning him, to him. So there are two versions of the verse. The version which is written with an aleph, the version which is read out loud with a vav. This is called the ktiv and kri. Let me get those two technical words on chat. The ktiv is the way the verse is written, and the kri or the kre is the way it's actually read out loud. So even though, so we have here a combination of aleph and yud. The aleph, um, the understanding which is represented by the divine name of God is together with the vav, which represents freedom. It's a kriyan ksiv. There's a way the verse is written, the way the verse is spoken. Avodat Yom Kippurim ihu ba'arichas. We have a long service on Yom Kippur, a lot of davening, a lot of praying. Ihu klila mitlat dargin, and all of the service of God on Yom Kippur has three levels to it: machshava, dibur, u'maisa. The three levels in divine service on Yom Kippur are mental service, speaking the prayers, and Maisa, doing good things. Okay, now, I don't want to dwell too long on the mystical nature of Yom Kippur. Let's flash directly into what this means as far as the practice of blowing the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur is concerned. The Lavush is the earliest halachic source dealing with this issue. That's not true. It's the earliest source which speaks the arichas. It's the earliest source which speaks at length, explaining the blowing of the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur. Achar she'amru Hashem Elokim. We're going to say at the very end of Yom Kippur those three words: Hashem hu Elokim. Hashem is our God. Omrim Kadesh Shalem, and then we say Kaddish. V'tokin Tekia achas. And then after Kaddish, we blow on the shofar a single blast. Da, that's Tekia. Da, a simple blast. He simin siluk shchina shemistakelis. The blowing of the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur signals the departure of the Shekhinah the departure of the divine presence. For the whole of Yom Kippur, we are together with the Shekhinah, the divine presence, and the divine presence leaves us at the end of Yom Kippur, and that's what is signaled by the blowing of the shofar. Oleh ad rakia, the divine presence, the Shekhinah goes back to the heavens. Kamo shahaya b'matan Torah. This is very similar to what happened when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. What happened when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai? You remember the Kedusha, the sanctity, the holiness of Mount Sinai was a very temporary matter among the temporary mitzvot which applied to Mount Sinai was Hagbalah, the mitzvah of Hagbalah. There you have it typed on chat. The Jews had to keep their distance from Mount Sinai for 3 days. Even before the Torah was given, the Jews were commanded to keep their distance from Mount Sinai. No one, except Moshe Rabbeinu, no one was allowed to ascend. No one was allowed to go up to the top of the mountain. This is a temporary mitzvah. Has absolutely no application today. Well, we're not exactly sure where Mount Sinai is, but even if you knew where it was, you're not allowed to climb there today. There's no Kedusha left in Mount Sinai today. It was a temporary business, a temporary Kedusha, only in the time of the giving of the Torah. And it says in the verse in the Torah, B'mshol chayovel, when the sound of the shofar was heard at the end of the giving of the Torah, Hema Ya'alu Bahar. That was the signal to the people that now the Kedusha, the sanctity of Mount Sinai, has departed, has evaporated, and therefore you want to go for a picnic on Mount Sinai. Now it's okay. For the previous 3 days, there was a divine commandment that no one should approach the mountain. When they heard the shofar blow, that was the signal that the Kedusha had evaporated, that the divine presence had left Mount Sinai, and there was no longer any special Kedusha there. Allah Elokim Betruah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu lifted the Kedusha from Mount Sinai. It was only a temporary Kedusha. The Gam Tekia Simin Simcha V'Nitzuach. So the first reason that we blow shofar according to the Levush is to indicate that the Kedusha, the sanctity of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, has left us, just like happened at Mount Sinai. Now the second reason is Simcha V'Nitzuach. Here's the second reason for blowing the shofar at the end. Lomar, blowing the shofar at the end has a second meaning, a second implication, not only the departure of the Shekhinah, Nitzachnu et HaSatan. We've conquered the Satan, the Yetzer Hara. We've conquered the evil within us. We've done tshuva. We've repented, and at the moment we are pure. We hope that condition is going to last for as long as it can, but we blow the shofar to indicate the victory over the Satan, the victory over the Yetzer Hara. Now we are pure. וגם הוא מתערבב בתקיעה זו, שיזכור יום מיתתו, לא יוכל לקטרג. The Yetzer Hara is discombobulated by this blowing of the shofar. When we hear the blowing of the shofar, it has such a strong impression upon our soul that the purity of Yom Kippur will last. We will be reluctant to sin. We will continue our state of purity for a longer time. Ma'arvin oto ata ki ata u'chozer l'shlot aleinu. Now, once Yom Kippur has finished, the Yetzer Hara is going to begin again, trying to lead us into sin. The blowing of the shofar will give us strength to remember to resist the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. Harei hayom lo yol shalat aleinu. On Yom Kippur, the Yetzer Hara had no control over us. Yom Kippur is the day in the year where we are so devoted, so dedicated to clinging to God that Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, has no force, no strength over us on that day. Oh, but at the end, we need the blast of the Tekia to strengthen us in our resolve not to sin again. So far we have two reasons for blowing the shofar. One, just like at Mount Sinai, it's the end of the special Kedusha. Second reason, trumpet blast to represent our victory over the Yetzer Hara. Va'od, another reason for blowing the shofar, ki Tekia shofar hu simin cherus. Just like we saw in the Zohar on the previous screen, blowing the shofar represents cherut, represents a kind of freedom. כי ביום הזה נעשו נשמות חירות מעברס גופו. On Yom Kippur, your soul is freed from the enslavement of a sinful body, and that's something to blow the trumpet about. וגם הגופות נשתחררו משיבוד עונשן. Before Yom Kippur, you were subject to punishments for the sins you had done. Now that you have been forgiven on Yom Kippur for those sins, so you are free of the onus, free of the punishment which would have accompanied those sins. That's worthy of a shofar blast, just like the Zohar instructed us on the previous screen. Freedom from sin, freedom from onesh, from penalty. Va'od tamacher, another reason for blowing the shofar. Hainu mishum shehu zeichel et kiyas hayovel. Another reason is that back in the days when the Beis HaMikdash was standing, back in the days in the temple, once every 50 years was the Jubilee year, and once every 50 years on the Jubilee year, on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, they used to blow the shofar, and that was the signal for the freeing of slaves. All slaves were freed on on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee of the Yovel year, once every 50 years, and the blowing of the shofar was the signal that all slaves were freed. And so we have Zecher Lemikdash. We remember, we don't have Yovel nowadays. We don't have the Jubilees because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash. When the temple is rebuilt, again, we will start the 50-year cycle, but we won't have slavery. But in order to remember the blowing of the shofar back in the days of the Beit HaMikdash, we blow it now on every Yom Kippur because every 50 years on Yom Kippur, they used to blow the shofar in the Beit HaMikdash to free all the slaves. Haita Yom Kippur, Lachein Token. We blow the shofar to remember that. All these reasons, so many different reasons. It's because of Mount Sinai, indicating the departure of the divine presence. It's like Simcha. We've overcome, we've conquered the Yetzer Hara. It's a sign of Herus, being freed from the burden of punishment for the sins we have committed. And it's a way of remembering what used to go on every 50 years in the Beit HaMikdash every Yom Kippur. Whenever I read so many reasons for a minhag, I'm reminded of what my grandfather used to say. Whenever you have many reasons for something, you have to suspect that probably none of them is the correct one. Usually things have one clear reason to them. So many reasons. A little bit suspicious. My nervousness is now increased over this minhag. Is this not somehow a violation of what the Torah commanded us? Not to add any new practices, not to add any new commandments to the list of 613, which we have in the Torah. Okay, now let's go back a little bit in time into the Middle Ages. The Shibbolei Aleket, Ashkenaz Rishon, Achi Rav Binyamin Katav. The Shibbolei Leket writes in the name of his brother. They didn't have family names back then. His brother wrote, "Masha nahagu litko b'motza Yom Kippurim lefi shashofar hu sani goran liYisrael b'Rosh Hashanah." The reason we blow the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur is because on Rosh Hashanah, 10 days earlier, it's the shofar that defended us in the heavenly court when we were being judged. Kodesh Baruch Hu omed mekisei din l'rachamim umatzdik otanu b'din. On Rosh Hashanah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us a merciful verdict, and we want to remember that. We want to remember the merciful verdict that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us on Rosh Hashanah 10 days earlier when we were being judged. Ata, and now on Yom Kippur, shen yotzim bebeit adin zakain gazar dinan nehtam l'schus, and now on Yom Kippur, when the favorable verdict given to us on Rosh Hashanah is being sealed. After all, it's not enough for the divine judge just to pronounce the verdict. It requires the stamp of approval of the divine court. The sealing of the verdict occurs on Yom Kippur. Hasanigor shalahem hu yotze imahem umashma kolo b'simcha. Just like in an earthly court, where if you have a favorable judgment, you have a good verdict, and you are acquitted in a earthly court, as when you leave the courtroom, when you leave the courthouse, you celebrate, and you celebrate together with your lawyer, the defense lawyer who successfully defended you in the criminal court here on earth. You're acquitted, you get a good verdict. When you leave the courtroom, when you leave the courthouse, of course you celebrate together with your defense lawyer. And that's the shofar. The shofar was our defense lawyer 10 days earlier when we had the favorable verdict. V'chein derech ha'olam sheba'alei hariv notzchim et adin. This is the way it happens. This is what happens when there's conflict and people fight with each other. And mekalsin et sanigoranu smeichim imo, the side which wins in a court case celebrates together with the sanigor, together with the defense attorney, and that's the shofar. Further, my brother also wrote another reason. He found another reason. My brother found another reason to blow the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur, according to what it says in this midrash of Rabbi Eliezer. Kisha Allah Moshe Rabbeinu lekabel luchot achronot. Moshe Rabbeinu made 2 trips up to the top of Mount Sinai. After the first trip, when he brought down the 10 Commandments, those ended up smashed on the ground. Everyone remembers the story of the Cheta Egel, the calf that they worshipped. Moshe went back up to the top of Mount Sinai and got a replacement set for the 10 Commandments. Well, when Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Mount Sinai the second time with the replacement set of 10 Commandments, Allah b'Rosh Chodesh Elul, that his second trip up to the top of Mount Sinai began on Rosh Chodesh Elul. He went up 30 days before Rosh Hashanah. Yarad Basar B'Tishrei, and he didn't come down he was up there for 40 days from the beginning of Elul until the 10th of Tishrei, until Yom Kippur. Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Mount Sinai the second time with the replacement 10 Commandments on Yom Kippur. V'tziva litkoa ba'aliyato v'yiridato, and when Moshe Rabbeinu came down into the campment with the replacement 10 Commandments, they blew the shofar to welcome him. That's another reason why we do it. Lachein, therefore, hitkinu dorot acharonim, therefore we have this recent Johnny come lately minhag. This is not an ancient practice rooted in the Gemara and the Mishnah. This is a recent, Dorot Achronim, recent generations have started this minhag, this practice of blowing the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur, Litkoa, Belel Rosh Chodesh Elul. We even begin blowing the shofar at the beginning of Elul. Anyone who attends the synagogue for Shacharis knows that already 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, beginning on Rosh Chodesh Elul, right now, you go to shul for Shacharis, they blow the shofar after Shacharis. And similarly, we blow the shofar after Yom Kippur. All of this is to remember the blowing of the shofar when Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the replacement Ten Commandments on Yom Kippur. This is a very interesting explanation, series of explanations of blowing the shofar. And what makes it interesting for a cynical person like me, as you know, my cynicism is a great weight upon my shoulders. I just must learn to live with it. A cynical person like me is captured by the idea that this is explicitly characterized as a new practice, a new minhag, which just began quite recently. And he wrote this in the late Middle Ages. Well, how recent is recent? You know, when rabbis talk about a recent development in halacha, halacha's got a very long history to it. And, like what one person might call recent, another person might call the distant past. How recent is this? Well, let's see how early we can find a reference to this. I know I already said it's not in the Mishnah, not in the Gemara, not in any of the halachic midrashim of Chazal. I checked all that. It's definitely not there. Let's see how early we can find a reference to this blowing of the shofar. Rav Amram Gaon, one of the Gaonim of Babylonia, he was a Rosh Yeshiva in Babylonia after the close of the Gemara, when the Gemara was finally edited and published. The great yeshivas, Sura, Pumbedita, the great yeshivas of Babylonia did not close shop. They continued for centuries. And the Rosh Yeshiva there were called Gaonim. One of them was Rav Amram Gaon. And he wrote, La'achar Oseh Shalom. Like Oseh Shalom is at the end of Kaddish, at the end of Yom Kippur. Come to the end of Yom Kippur, you recite Kaddish. The end of Kaddish is Oseh Shalom Bimromav Yaseh Shalom Aleinu. After that, Tokim b'shofar Kashrat Pamachat. We blow on the shofar Kashrat one time. Kashrat is the kuf is Tekia, da. The shin is shvarim, da da da. The resh is trua, da 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 da. And the final kuf is again a tekia, da. We blow the shofar after Kaddish exactly once in the following way, da 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 da. That's the way we blow the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur. V'holchim lebatehem b'shalom, and everyone returns home in peace because Yom Kippur has successfully ended. Now we notice that not only does this minhag have its origin shortly after the close of the Gemara, but we also notice that back in those days, the minhag was to blow 4 notes: Tekia, Shvarim, Trua, and Tekia. I know that in my synagogue, they don't do that. In my synagogue, they blow a single note, a Tekia, da, which is apparently not the minhag in ancient Babylonia, where all this got started. Of course, the minhag could not have gotten started much earlier, because then it would be in the Mishnah and Gemara. Since it's not in the Mishnah and Gemara, the Gaonic source represents the origin of the minhag. Now let's take a look at another text from the Gaonic period, Babylonia, after the close of the Gemara, from a collection of Shelot and Shuvot. Many different Gaonim are quoted in this Sefer. This particular tshuva that we're looking at is a quotation of Rav Haigon. Oh, he was one of the greatest of the Gaonim. Sha'altem al inyan Tekia shofar b'motzei Yom Kippurim. You asked me why we blow the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur. And he answers, Minhagenu, it is our minhag, it is our practice, litkoa tashrat. We blow four tones, four sounds at the end of Yom Kippur, Tekia, Shvarim, Teruah, and Tekia, just like Rav Amram wrote. That's what they were doing in Babylonia, four tones. We do it as Yom Kippur is ending, and this is true everywhere in Babylonia, in every shul in Babylon, every synagogue in Babylonia. That's how we do it. V'lo matzinu tam chova, but we see no reason why this is obligatory. It's not a mitzvah min haTorah, not mentioned in the Torah anywhere. It's not a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. There's no halachic obligation to do this in the Mishnah and Gemara. There's no Torah source, no rabbinic source for this, and therefore it's simply not chovah, simply not obligatory. You don't want to do it? Don't do it. It's in no sense obligatory. Eladome kihu zeicha liyovel. The only reason we do it is to remember the Jubilee year, the 50-year cycle. It's a ne'emar because in the Jubilee year, every 50 years, the verse in the Torah says, Havat shofar trua b'chodesh hashvi b'asol chodesh b'yom kippurim. The Torah says, once every 50 years, on Yom Kippur, you blow the shofar. Ta'aviru shofar b'chol artzechem, you blow the shofar throughout the land to free the slaves. Well, that's what they did back in the days when the Beis Hamikdash was standing, back in the days of the Torah. We don't have the 50-year cycle anymore because we don't have the Beis Hamikdash. Minhagenu b'chol shana v'shana atu yovel. We blow the shofar on Yom Kippur every year to remember the Jubilee year. We do it every year to remember the 50-year cycle in the temple, in the Beis Hamikdash. Now, we learn from Rav Haigon that there are two categories of minhagim. There are some minhagim which are obligatory, chovah. Ashkenazim have a minhag not to eat rice on Pesach. Other groups have other minhagim. Some minhagim are obligatory. But blowing the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur does not fall into that category. This is a kind of minhag, which, well, it's something people do. It is a minhag, it is a practice. People are doing it, but it is in no sense obligatory, according to Rav Hai. Now my nervousness is dissipating a little bit. I'm beginning to feel a little bit better when Rav Haigon teaches us it's not obligatory. You don't want to do it? Don't do it. Okay. If I don't have to do it, so I won't do it. And I won't run the risk of violating the commandment of the Torah that prohibits me from adding any new practices to the Torah. Oh, now I can relax a little bit, since I know I don't have to do it. If they ask me to blow the shofar in the synagogue at the end of Yom Kippur, I can say, ain't li koach, I'm out of strength, have someone else do it. I don't have to do it. In no sense. If it were obligatory and they called upon me to do it, well, if there's an obligation and you're asked to fulfill an obligation, you should, of course, stride forward and do it. Well, this, I can in good conscience say, let someone, if someone else wants to do it, fine. If you can't find anyone else who wants to do it, let's skip it. Sefer Mitzvah Sagola. at the very end of the Gaonic period, the beginning of the Rishonim. Nahagu ha'am l'tkoa kashat. The practice of the people is to blow those four sounds, Tekia, Shvarim, Teruah, Tekia, at the end of Yom Kippur. Ein zeicha liyovel. Everyone who taught us, all those rabbis who just finished teaching us on the previous screens, all of those who said it has something to do with remembering the Jubilee year, they're wrong. This has nothing to do with the Jubilee year. Well, be reasonable. What connection does this have with the Jubilee year? The Sefer HaMitzvahs writes, Imkain, if it were connected somehow with the Jubilee year, with the 50-year cycle, lo hayinu osim kach b'chol shana, then we wouldn't do it every year. We do it only once every 50 years if it were somehow intended to remind us of the 50-year cycle. How does blowing the shofar every year remind you of a 50-year cycle? There's nothing to do. There's nothing to do. Shofar has nothing to do with a 50-year cycle. If it were intended to remind us of that, we would do it once every 50 years. Oh, furthermore, Yom Kippurim atzmo dino. Furthermore, it all has to do with Yom Kippur. Hochmahi ve'ena malacha. Blowing the shofar is a hochma, and it is not a malacha. It is an act of artistry. It is not a labor. My oh my, what on earth is he talking about? I explain. On Yom Kippur, all of the halachot of Shabbat apply. You're not allowed to carry things in the public domain on Shabbat. You're not allowed to carry things in the public domain on Yom Kippur. You're not allowed to write on Shabbat. You're not allowed to write on Yom Kippur. All of the halachot of Shabbat apply on Yom Kippur. That's simple and straightforward. The Torah itself says that Yom Kippur is Shabbat Shabbaton. The Torah itself says that Yom Kippur has all the dinim, all the halachot of Shabbat. Well, one of the halachot of Shabbat is you're not allowed to play a musical instrument. And indeed, when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, we don't blow the shofar. Playing a musical instrument, a trumpet, whatever it is prohibited on Shabbat, and therefore should be prohibited on Yom Kippur as well. Why, oh why, do we blow the shofar on Yom Kippur just before Yom Kippur ends? We don't wait a few minutes until Yom Kippur is really over. We blow the shofar a few moments before Yom Kippur ends. What's the justification for that? The Gemara says that blowing the shofar is not a malacha, is not an act of labor, is not work. It's chokhmah, something which requires artistry, something which requires wisdom, something which requires skill. It's a skill and not an act of work. That's supposed to be the justification for blowing the shofar before Yom Kippur is actually finished. So we don't blow the shofar. It has nothing to do with the Jubilee year, nothing to do with the 50-year cycle like all the other rabbis say. Yesh Lama, we have to say, Shenitkan Mishum Amrina B'Midrash, it must be that we blow the shofar towards the end, right before the end of Yom Kippur, based on the Midrash, B'motza Yom Kippurim, Bat Kol Yotzeit V'Omeret, at the end of Yom Kippur, a heavenly voice calls out, Leich echol b'simcha lachmacha, go home and eat your meal and rejoice. A heavenly voice instructs us to eat a festive meal after Yom Kippur, a festive meal to rejoice because we've been forgiven of our sins. Mipnei she'ein yom tov zeh mifursam, and since not everyone realizes that the festive meal after Yom Kippur is itself a mitzvah, and one must celebrate and rejoice in that meal. Since not everyone understands that, we blow the shofar to remind them, go home and eat the meal with simcha. It's a sudas mitzvah, the meal on Motzei Shabbat, on Motzei Yom Kippur. After Yom Kippur, that meal is a mitzvah. Asu bo takana lefarsamo, we blow the shofar to remind the people how important the festive meal is after Yom Kippur. That's why we blow Tashrat. That's why we blow Tekia, Shvarim, Trua, Tekia. That's why we blow it, so as to remind the people to rejoice in the meal which they eat after Yom Kippur. My oh my, we're just piling on top of one reason on top of another uh, to try to justify the blowing of the shofar, and so far, all of the older sources from the days of the Gaonim up to the Sefer Mitzvah Gadol, which is right at the end of the Gaonic period, the beginning of the Rishonim, he too says Tashat, four tones are blown. Now, what exactly is the distinction between malacha, labor, work, which is prohibited on Shabbat and Yom Kippur, as opposed to Chochmah, something which is merely artistry, something which is merely a skill, and therefore okay. And shofar falls into the second category of skill. Now, what is the precise difference between them? The Sefer Ketava Kabbalah is one of my favorites. Back in the 19th century, with the growth of the Reform movement, many rabbis responded to the growth of the Reform movement by writing Sfarim devoted to proving that every drasha, everything that Chazal said is based on verses in the Torah, really flows out of the precise meaning of the verses. And there were three great Sfarim written in the 19th century devoted to the purpose of proving that everything which Chazal said truly flows out of the precise meaning of the verses of the Torah. There was the Malbim wrote such a sefer, a commentary on the Torah. The Torah Tamima is quite popular. It does exactly the same thing. And my favorite of the three is the Ketav Kabbalah that we're about to quote from the end of the 19th century. But I always get the name of the author confused. His name was Rav Yaakov Tzvi, but I always get confused whether his family name was Mecklenburg or Königsberg. He was either Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg from Königsberg, or he was from Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg from Königsberg. I always get confused in his name. In any event, he points out that in order for something to be a malacha and therefore prohibited on Shabbat and Yom Kippur, it has to be something which is mitaken, something which has an effect, something which affects natural things in the world. You take dough and you bake it. You've changed the dough into bread. That's a malacha. You take a piece of paper, pen, and pencil, and you write on it, you've changed something in the natural world. In order for a malacha to be a malacha, something has to change in the natural world. When the Sefer Mitzvah Sagadol said that blowing the shofar is not a malacha, well, the reason it's not a malacha is because nothing changes in the physical world. Very different than baking bread, very different than writing on paper. It is, however, a chachma, it is a skill, and therefore, in general, prohibited midrabanan on Shabbat and Yom Kippur. But since it's only the Rabbanan, it becomes permissible in order to fulfill this minhag at the end of Yom Kippur, in the period of time between sunset and the appearance of the stars. the period of time between sunset and the appearance of the stars, that entire interval of time between sunset and the appearance of the stars, that entire interval of time is a suffix, a doubt about whether it belongs to the previous day or the following day. After all, the verses in Sefer Breshit, everyone is familiar with the verses in the beginning of the book of Genesis, in the beginning of Breshit. Different verses talk about different ways of distinguishing one day from another. Some of the verses in the Torah say, in the beginning of Genesis, say that God created the sun to distinguish between day and night. The day ends and night begins when the sun sets. On the other hand, there are other verses in the beginning of Breshit, in the beginning of the book of Genesis, which say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created light and darkness to distinguish between day and night. According to these verses, the day flips from one day to the next, not when the sun sets, but when it gets dark, which is, depending what latitude you're at, that's 15, 20, 30 minutes after sunset. So that interval of time between sunset and the appearance of the stars is a doubt. Does it belong to the previous day or the following day? During this period of time, there's certain leniencies regarding Chochmah as opposed to Malacha. Malacha is prohibited both at the beginning of Shabbat, at the beginning of Yom Kippur, and at the end during this interval of time, because either might be Yom Kippur, either might be Shabbat. But for things that are not truly Malacha, like blowing the shofar, there's room for leniency. Now let's go to the end of the Rishonim, going more or less in chronological order here. The Mordechai, Ashkenaz, late Ashkenaz Rishon, Token Tekia Achas L'Zecha Yovel. Finally, at the end of the period of the Rishonim, we have a source for what they do in my synagogue to blow a single tone, Tekia, da, and not four tones, like all the earlier sources refer to. Dichtiv, Havarta Shofar, and the reason we do it is like what it says about the Jubilee year, to remember the Jubilee year when they blew four tones every 50 years to free the slaves. Rav Paltoigon, he quotes an earlier source from Babylonia, Tokim b'shofar Tekia, Shlosha Shvarim Trua Tekia. He quotes the Gaonim from Babylonia who say to blow four tones. Simon Kashat, Tekia, Shvarim, Trua, Tekia. That's what they were doing in the big yeshivas in Babylonia back in those days, in the days of the Gaonim in Surah and Pumbedita. Nira l'Ravya kisvaras agon mishum de'amrinin shava yovel Tekiyas ubrachas. Since the Gemara says flat out that the blowing of the shofar on the 50th year has all the same halachas as blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, and since on Rosh Hashanah you have four tones, therefore the Gaonim said to remember the 50-year cycle where the halachas of blowing the shofar were the same as Rosh Hashanah that year, you need four tones. However, nearly to Kulei Hai Katanas Rabbi Bahulo Avdina, but I don't think we have to go so far. We don't need so much. It's enough a single tone to remind us of all of this. And they asked Reba Yehuda, they asked him, why do we blow the shofar before Havdalah? Of course, at the end of Yom Kippur, everyone's hungry. At the end of Shabbat, you don't have to rush home as fast as you can to make Havdalah when Shabbat is over. You take your time. There's no big rush when Shabbat is over to make Havdalah. But when Yom Kippur ends, even if you're not so desperate yourself to, you have household members who really want to eat and drink. You rush home as fast as is reasonable in order to make Havdalah as quick as possible, as soon as Yom Kippur is over, so that those who are in a big rush to eat and drink can do so. Why do we blow the shofar before? it's time for Havdalah. Why do we blow the shofar before 3 stars have appeared? Halo asru lasot malacha kodem sheyavdil. Should it be prohibited? It should be prohibited to do any malacha, any labor, any work before the appearance of 3 stars. Aval Tekia shofar hachmahi. But as we learned on the previous screen, blowing of the shofar is not actually a malacha because it doesn't change anything in the physical world. Very different than baking dough into bread, very different than writing with ink on paper. And therefore, there's no reason to be so strict about it, and it's okay to blow the shofar as long as the sun has set, even though 3 stars have not yet appeared. And in my synagogue, that's exactly what they do. The shofar is blown after sunset, but before the appearance of the three stars. Yom Kippur is not yet over. You cannot light your cigarette yet. If you're in a rush to light up, you cannot do anything, which would be a violation of Yom Kippur or Shabbat. But this is not, strictly speaking, a violation of Malacha. Coming down into the more recent poskim at the beginning of modern times, the Tur, the first of the great poskim. Well, let's let historians argue about exactly when the Middle Ages began and exactly what year modern times began, but that was the time of the Tur, right at the cusp between the Rishonim and the Acharonim. The Tur, most rabbis consider him to be a Rishon, but he's right at that point of time. The Tur wrote, Yesh noagim litkoa miyad achar tfilas ne'ila kodem arvis. In Spain, he was in Spain, the practice is to blow the shofar after Ne'ilah before Ma'ariv, before Arvit, that is before the appearance of 3 stars. Afapisha Dailo Evdilu, you cannot make Havdalah yet because you can't light a match. Ein Choshishim Kevan Tekia shofar ein malacha, but Tekia shofar is not strictly speaking a malacha. It does not create anything, does not change anything. Nachon yoter lahamtin ad achara. It'd be better to wait until 3 stars appear. Vafilu im yitka kodem shevdil ein lachush. It would be better to wait until 3 stars appear, but it's okay as long as the sun has set. And the same idea is emphasized a few years later on the Ashkenaz side of the divide. The Tur was in Spain. On the Ashkenaz side in France, the Tosafot say just a few years later, Lo chayshin and shema yelech etzel baki, even though blowing the shofar is prohibited on Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbat, the reason we prohibit shofar on Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbat is because we're afraid someone's not going to know how to blow the shofar. He'll carry the shofar through the public domain to an expert, to a musician who will be able to blow the shofar for him. And we don't want to run the risk of the shofar being carried through the public domain, and therefore we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbat. It's not this year. Well, and it's Tekia Ahas. In the days of the Tosafot, they blow a single note. Eina Elamishum Zeichel Yovel, we blow the shofar because we want to remember the Yovel. And it would be better to have the series of what he calls 3 notes, but I call 4 notes because he counts Shvarim and Trua as a single tone. Just to finish up before we come to conclusions, Rabbeinu Yitzchak, the Ri is among the most influential. He and Rabbeinu Tam were the two biggest figures in the days of the Balei Tosafot. Masha tokim b'motza Yom Kippurim eina ela lahodiyah shulayla. The reason we blow the shofar on Yom Kippur is now for a whole new reason that we never heard of before. All of a sudden, he says the reason we blow it is to tell the people that Yom Kippur is over and now you can light up your cigarettes. Back in those days, they didn't know how dangerous cigarette smoking is. Well, I know that tobacco came from the New World and they didn't have cigarettes back in those days, but they had other leaves which they were smoking, and well, you can't. Of course, on Shabbat and Yom Tov, you cannot do any of the 39 labors. To tell the people that now you can begin any of the 39 labors, the shofar is a sign of Havdalah. Yochlu ad b'nei shedanu. After you've fasted, the shofar tells the people now the fast is over. The people who are at home and not in the synagogue, when they hear the shofar blowing, that's the sign that they can start eating and drinking. Gam la'achin sudat motza Yom Kippurim. You're going to need a festive meal after Yom Kippur, and the women folk. Back in those days, women knew their place in the kitchen. The women folk who were in the kitchen needed a signal when they could begin preparing the festive meal, and that's what the shofar was all about. The shofar was an announcement. Now Yom Kippur is over. You can do malacha. You can eat and drink. This idea that it has some connection with the Jubilee year is wrong. After all, we blow the shofar every year at the end of Yom Kippur. If it had something to do with the Yovel, we would do it once every 50 years. Okay, at this point, what we've seen is a diversity of thinking regarding the reason for the practice. Now, here comes the fundamental understanding of what makes a minhag, a practice, valid, even though it's not one of the 613 commandments. The underlying idea, which permits minhagim, even though the minhag might not be one of the 613 commandments, the underlying idea is every minhag, in order to be legitimate, every minhag, in order to be correct, every minhag, in order to be permissible, must somehow fulfill a real mitzvah of the Torah. There are 613 real mitzvahs of the Torah, and if the minhag somehow fulfills at least one of them, that justifies the minhag. That permits the minhag. The minhag is no longer an addition to the list of 613. It's a fulfillment of at least one of the 613. But as with many minhagim, the rabbis are divided about which of the 613 commandments is being fulfilled by a specific minhag. And when they disagree about which of the 613 commandments is being fulfilled by a specific minhag, they disagree about how to practice that minhag, exactly what it is you're supposed to do. According to Rav Hai Gaon and his team, blowing the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur, the minhag of blowing the shofar at the end of Yom Kippur, according to Rav Hai Gaon and his team, is to remember the Beis Hamikdash when they had the Jubilee year once every 50 years. And after all, remembering the Beis Hamikdash, Zeicher LeMikdash, is part of the mitzvah of Mora HaMikdash, fear. Awe of the Beis Hamikdash is one of the 613 commandments, one of the legitimate commandments, which even nowadays we are commanded to have awe of the Beis Hamikdash. Well, if the mitzvah we are fulfilling is Zeicher LeMikdash, which is part of Mora HaMikdash, which is part of the awe that we are commanded to feel for the Beis Hamikdash, well, it all has to do with the Jubilee year, and we need a sequence of 4 shofar blasts. On the other hand, according to the Tosafot and their team, all those who are following the Tosafot, the minhag of blowing the shofar has to do with Havdalah, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, L'Kadasho. We remember the day of Shabbat or Yom Tov or Yom Kippur by marking it at the beginning and the end. We mark off the beginning and end of Yom Kippur, and therefore marking off the end of Yom Kippur with a shofar blast is part of the mitzvah of Zahor, remembering the beginning and end of every Shabbat, every Yom Tov, every Yom Kippur, which is one of the 613 commandments. Lachain, Tekia achas, and for that, a single shofar blast is enough, a Tekia. Well, as with all other minhagim, in order for the minhag to be legitimate, it must be rooted as if in the fulfillment of at least one of the 613 commandments, where the rabbis are divided about which commandment it is that you are fulfilling. By executing the minhag, then the way you do it will vary according to which of the mitzvahs it is that you're fulfilling. With this, I'm going to pause. Next week in this time slot, I'm going to be talking about the practice of, as far as I know, every synagogue where everyone is given an aliyah l'Torah. Everyone is given an aliyah to make a bracha on the Torah, on Simchat Torah. So we'll be talking about Simchas Torah next week, and everyone getting aliyah, another minhag, which is very difficult to justify, but we'll see the reasons for it and the justifications next week. Until then, I wish you a good week, a safe week, Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you all again next week. Shalom, shalom.
Very much, Rabbi.
So much, Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom.
You're welcome. Good Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom.
You.
You're welcome. My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. You're welcome. Be well.